Let me have it said on record that I'm not really much of an anime fan. I don't hate anime or dislike it all that much, I just never found most of it appealing. All of the massive multi-season series with tons of interwoven narratives and characters to keep track of, not to mention some kind of associated manga that you obviously have to read in order to get the full experience. While I don't doubt that there's a lot of good qualities and merits to many popular anime series, I've never considered myself someone who has the time or patience to commit to watching one all the way through, let alone get invested in the first place. At the same time though, I do find Japanese animation to be very interesting, and would love to find a series that isn't too long or convoluted, doesn't demand too much preliminary or outside knowledge from the viewer, but still has a captivating premise, world, and set of characters for me to enjoy. The question is though, does such a series actually exist? Apparently yes, and it's called Kaiba. A little 12-part anime series made back in 2008, Kaiba is quite the hidden gem. At a glance, you'd probably assume that it leans heavily into the bizarre and zany sides of Japanese animation. And you'd be right. Kaiba is weird. Very weird. But it's also surprisingly mature and has a lot of heavy real-life themes, something I honestly wasn't expecting. It's complete coincidence that I stumbled across Kaiba in the first place too. I saw some clips of it on YouTube ages ago, did a little bit of research, and managed to track down the full series. 12 episodes wasn't much of a commitment, so I decided to watch through it, figuring it would be decently entertaining at least. Based on what little of it I had already seen, I was mostly just prepared for general zaniness and surreal storytelling. But what I wasn't prepared for was the incredibly powerful emotional rollercoaster this series put me through. Kaiba kept me engaged, it kept me guessing, and it even managed to pull a few tears from my eyes with its subplots and characters. I haven't been captivated by a story like this in a long time, and I have to give Kaiba a lot of credit for managing to subvert expectations and create an experience that has way more depth than what you might assume just from looking at it. That being said, the visual aspect of Kaiba is still very much something that deserves to be mentioned, and I think that's also the best place to start off. Before I had watched the whole thing, I vaguely remember someone describing the art style of Kaiba as sci-fi through the eyes of a preschooler, and after watching it through, I can totally see what they meant by that. The animation in Kaiba is very unique, especially compared to what most people think of when they hear the word anime nowadays. In place of complex designs and elaborate color schemes, Kaiba employs very simple and direct designs for all of its objects, characters, and locations, often with very little regard for realism or practicality. Many of the locations remind me of things from Dr. Seuss books, just with a sci-fi twist. Similarly, all of the characters have fairly simple, cartoony designs, which actually helps them stand out from one another. Much of Kaiba's art style and general aesthetic is built around spheres, curves, bubbles, and rounded shapes, and many of the objects, devices, vehicles, and characters featured in the anime embody this aesthetic, though some are notably more rounded than others.
Impressive.
The music too is also marvelous and has a lot of variety to it, with tracks that are able to create strong feelings of dread, drama, whimsy. And even action. Seriously, I love the chase music, it never gets old. All of this gives off an atmosphere of the world being a product of a young child's vivid imagination, and creates this wonderfully charming bubble punk aesthetic that I think is one of Kaiba's best aspects. In an age where CGI and video games are all striving to have ultra-realistic graphics and make everything as detailed as possible, I found myself preferring animation that's more simple and stylized, where the goal isn't just to add more detail, but rather to cultivate a distinct atmosphere and emotional background to a story through specific, well-designed visuals. This is something Kaiba does quite well with its art style. While the worlds and characters it presents can often look strange and silly, there's still plenty of consistency and meaning to their designs, which is something that I think even well-established anime series can fail to account for sometimes. I'm not much of an artist myself, at least not on the visual side of things, but I know that connecting the overall style of a world to its story and messages is both a very difficult and very crucial thing to accomplish in order to make a piece of fiction compelling. And thankfully, this is something Kaiba manages to pull off. While its visual style might have you thinking that this is a series for kids or something, Kaiba features a complex and surprisingly dark universe that I became thoroughly invested in as I watched it. In my limited experience as a speculative fiction writer, I'd best describe Kaiba as soft sci-fi to its furthest and strangest extremes. The technology in Kaiba borders on pure magic, with very little of it having any roots in real science. Ever wanted to have a device that can create the girl of your dreams? What about a gun that can freeze people in place, open up their minds, and let you walk around in their memories like a Looney Tunes character? Or what about a gun that kills people so hard it turns them into goo? Literally. All of these are funny and clever examples, of course, but none of them have the significance of Kaiba's memory implant technology, which is one of the most important elements of its universe. Without spoiling too much, in Kaiba, a technology was developed in the distant future that allows humans to store memories and entire personalities on small cone-shaped chips. These chips can be safely extracted from a person's body and put in a new body, allowing them to transfer their consciousness to any form they see fit. Individual memories can also be extracted from and injected into these chips at will, allowing people to remove memories they dislike and replace them with better ones. The existence of such a technology obviously comes with an enormous amount of implications, and Kaiba doesn't hesitate to explore this concept and show just what kind of an impact it could have on society as a whole. When consciousness is made malleable, rich people can swap their bodies as often as they like, burning through a multitude of different forms like passing fashion trends. You've got entire nations of people transferring themselves into aquatic bodies to live on water planets, tyrants prolonging their rule indefinitely by constantly fabricating clones to transfer their memories into. There's even a porn actress that duplicates the contents of her chip onto another one and puts it into a male body just so she can have sex with herself. At the same time, though, there's plenty of tragic and heartbreaking things connected to this technology. Little girls selling their bodies off to rich aristocrats so they can support their families, bodiless people trapped in machines and robots with no way of escaping, and lots of people holding on to the chips of deceased loved ones in the hopes that one day they can buy a new body to bring them back. In fact, when you really get down to it, Kaiba is kinda cyberpunk, but not in a shallow, tech-bad, future-bleak kind of way. Instead, it goes the extra mile to show that human nature can still remain fallible even in the face of wondrous technological development. Even with all of these incredible devices and the advent of space travel, the universe of Kaiba is still filled with just as many vices and problems as our own. There's still greed and lust, apathy, corruption, and plenty of social inequity. While memory technology can make these things worse, it isn't held up as the sole cause of them, nor as the sole solution, which is a perspective that I don't often see a lot of in mainstream sci-fi. In many dystopian settings, the blame is often pinned on a single entity, organization, or system that's seen as the root of all of society's current problems. If we got rid of X, or if we took down Y, things would be much better, wouldn't they? Well, no, not necessarily. Our world has a lot of nuance to it, and humans are very complex creatures. People that seem ruthless and hostile on the outside can often have very understandable goals or motivations driving them, just like how people that seem friendly and good-natured can be incredibly selfish and bitter on the inside. Kaiba plays a lot with these intricacies, but it rarely puts its foot down on what exactly is right or wrong. Instead, it presents the actions of specific characters as they happen naturally, shows their underlying motivations later, and then lets the viewer decide whether or not what they did was justified. There are a lot of characters in Kaiba on both sides of the spectrum when it comes to either enforcing the current status quo or rebelling against it, but neither of these sides are presented as the objective good guys of the story, mainly because that's not what the story is supposed to be about. Kaiba isn't a story about conflict, it's a love story, and I think that's the boldest choice of all. In a lot of science fiction focusing on the implications of advanced, controversial technologies, the conflict between supporters and detractors of such technology often takes center stage. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this if such a story is done well, but it's very refreshing when such a setting chooses instead to focus on a story that is only distantly related to the conflict that defines its universe. Kaiba starts very simply. A boy with a hole in his chest wakes up in a pile of rubble, possessing no memories of who or where he is. Around his neck is a locket containing a blurry photo of a girl he doesn't recognize. From there, things get very wild very quickly, and the protagonist, later on given the name of Warp, goes on a lengthy journey across the universe in a multitude of different forms. Ultimately, though, all of the adventures and memory meddling that occurs over the course of the series works to the end of reuniting a pair of lovers, a reunion that just so happens to have huge implications for an underground rebel movement and complex political conspiracy. The resolution of Kaiba's story comes not as a result of one faction triumphing over another, but rather the protagonist and associated characters reconnecting with each other, restoring their memories, and making peace with their past transgressions. It's a really touching spin on the standard dystopian formula, and I think it's a lot more relevant to the real world too. The average person probably won't start a revolution or go as far as to completely usurp the status quo of the modern world, but healing bonds with your loved ones and forgiving yourself over mistakes you've made in the past is perhaps even more important, and definitely something worth striving for regardless of who you are. That's a very poignant and powerful message, and one that Kaiba takes to heart with its storytelling. I don't want to spoil too much of the story though, so if you want to see how this all fits together, go watch it yourself. It's not that hard to find. Now, when all is said and done, can I say that I thoroughly enjoyed Kaiba? Yes, absolutely, there's no question about that. Would I call it a masterpiece, though? Well, I'm not sure I'd go that far. As good as it is, it's certainly not perfect. There's a big stylistic shift between the episodes in the first half of the series compared to those in the second half, and it does kinda lose its focus and consistency near the end. But despite all of this roughness around the edges, it's still such an odd and fascinating universe filled with so many fun and interesting characters that I can't help but consider it one of my all-time favorites. Kaiba isn't just a showcase of a unique animation style, or an impressively built universe. It's a showcase of humanity, in all our flawed, complicated beauty, and I think that's something the world could always use more of. Not stories that focus on what's right or wrong, but stories that focus on what's human, because that's the one thing we can all connect to.